Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and today I'm excited to announce that this is our 50th episode of the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and I really want to thank everyone for the support, feedback, and tuning in week after week. So here's to celebrating the milestone together, and thank you for being part of our podcast family. Now, for episode 50, our guest today is Carrie Mullins, and she is the author of a new book that was released May 7th, 2024, called The Book of Mothers: How Literature Can Help Us Reinvent Modern Motherhood. And we talked to her about her ancestry, her childhood growing up in Greenwich Village, and her interest early on in literature and history. We also talk about her time as a journalist, as well as being a former national editor at the James Baird award-winning website Serious Eats. And we also talk about her recent book and what she thinks the future of motherhood could be, as well as how she made her way out onto the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 50 with Carrie Mullins. This episode was recorded April 23rd, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'd like to just start off with if you could give us a little introduction where you were born and raised.
So I was born in New York City in the West Village, and have lived there most of my life. Went away for college and then lived in San Francisco for a little while, but mostly stayed around New York City.
Mm-hmm. And I like to ask an ancestry question. So do you know how far back, if you've done research with your ancestry on your parents?
So I was so excited that you asked this question when I saw that you were going to ask this question, because my grandmother was very interested in genealogy, and this was at a time before, 23andMe. So it was all done by reaching out to, churches and town halls, mostly in Europe. So I knew that part of my family was from around Naples and Italy. Bakers, farmers, that kind of thing. But when we started coming out to the North Fork, and we'd be out in Orient State Park, and my mom would point to Gardiner's Island and say, "Oh, one of our ancestors was accused of killing Gardner." And I thought this was like one of these bizarre family stories that kind of get passed down without any merit. Mm-hmm. But when I saw this question, I said, okay, I have to figure out if there's any basis to this. So my mom went into my grandmother's files, and it turns out there is. So I have ancestors, the Bennets, who came from Dorchester, England in 1639 and moved to Gardiner's Island around 3 Mile Harbor, and lived there for a couple generations. And then there was a Samuel Bennett who killed Lion Gardner III in a hunting accident. And he went to trial for murder, but was acquitted. So actually there is truth to this story, and also this wonderful connection to the North Fork. So our family ended up moving to East Hampton, and there's some Bennets buried there, and then also to Sag Harbor, where I had another interesting story, which is that there was a ship coming over from Ireland during the potato famine, the Catherine, and it sank outside of Sag Harbor. And there are only a few survivors, including a little baby girl who was adopted and named Catherine after the ship. And she is my great, 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 what have you, grandmother. So yes. It's kind of funny that after all this time, I verified that there is truth, and it's nice we have these ties to Gardiner's Island, which I look at all the time.
No, that's amazing. And was that's something your mother said that's kind of been passed down?
Yeah.
But you just hadn't confirmed.
Right, I hadn't confirmed it because it seemed so, it seemed so outlandish, in part because I thought Gardiner's Island was only occupied by the one family and didn't really have residents. So the whole thing didn't really make sense to me. But then actually when I started looking into the history and then also, found these notes that my grandmother had made, it seems like it's true. So, but at least he was acquitted. That's the important part.
Yes. And you mentioned, and then there was family from Naples area, and they had immigrated over here early on as well.
They came more recently. They came closer to the turn of the 20th century and settled in Connecticut.
And then in terms of your parents, what did they do for a living?
They were both lawyers. So my mom was from Connecticut and my dad was from New Jersey. And they both got into the law, which they suggested I not follow.
Oh. So. And how did they end up in, because you said you were raised in the West
in the West Village of New York City. They both moved, they met in New Haven, Connecticut, and then moved to the city for my dad's work and just stayed. I mean, they loved it. The village at that time was a lot different. It was genuinely full of artists and writers, and my dad's first apartment was a couple doors down from Bob Dylan, and so there used to just be fans, he said, on the street at all hours of the night calling up to the window, Bob, Bob,
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone was a fan of that, Bob Dylan or my dad. So.
And then for you growing up there, how was that experience, and what was kind of the time frame?
So I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, and at that time the village was still heavily artists, writers. I was thinking about the parents of the kids that I went to school with growing up, and they were writer, photographer, painter. So I think that was really influential in terms of understanding from a young age that these were careers that people did, and they seemed normal. They didn't seem, pie in the sky dreams. It was something that I saw very much actually in real life.
And do you have any memories of, as a child, maybe some things you might have done in the village as a child?
Gosh, I loved everything about it. We used to go a lot to an Italian bakery on Bleecker Street. That area has a Italian heritage, so there's this beautiful church there, and then there's a bakery that still exists, Rocco's, that's on Bleecker Street, but there used to be also like a bread bakery and just an Italian food shop, and so we used to go to those places, and my family loves to cook and eat, so that was always a big part of our lives.
Yes. And because it was definitely city living, would you be able to play outside as a kid and go to, I don't know if you would go to Washington Square Park or...
Yeah, it's funny. Well, the Washington Square Park at that time, it wasn't as dicey as it was when my parents first moved there, when my mom had a class that was on the other side of the park, and he used to go and pick her up so that he could escort her through. They called it Needle Park. So it wasn't that bad when I was growing up, but it was definitely still a little, although I guess now it's sort of fallen into disrepair again, but the West Side Highway, now it's this beautiful waterfront. They have done such an amazing job with the development of that. But when I was growing up, it was just a highway. So I went to a school that luckily has these huge gardens in the middle of the school buildings in a block in New York City, which is very unusual. And so I was really lucky to have that because it injected nature into my everyday life. But I think that's unusual for a lot of city kids.
And how was school for you? Were you going to school in the West Village?
I went to school in the West Village from kindergarten to 8th grade, and I love school. Then I went to high school in Brooklyn, and then went to New Haven for college, and then came back to the city and went to grad school at Columbia. So all of my school experiences were great. I think I could have stayed in school forever.
Yeah. And did you have a favorite subject, or were you interested in writing and any of the core classes that might have interested you through high school?
Yeah, I mean, I always loved writing and writing creatively and loved English. I think it's funny, I also love history, like love nonfiction books, love studying history. And I sort of had this feeling like I love English and I know I want to do something in that field over the long term. So I actually also focused a lot on history because I felt like school is my opportunity to really learn a lot about different subjects while I could. And then, so even in college, I was a history major. Yale has like a really wonderful history program. So I took advantage of that, knowing that I would be leaving and trying to go into fiction writing. So everyone's always sort of surprised by that path. But I think it's worked out, especially, for writing my book. It was very research intensive, which I love doing. I could just be holed up in the library researching all day and be happy.
But for coming out of high school, did you know what you wanted to do?
I knew I wanted to write. I think like most teenagers, I had no sense of how you would turn that into a living. What the day-to-day looks like for a writer. So that was something I had to learn over time. Would it be a magazine? Would it be freelancing? I don't think I even really understood what freelancing was. And then also over the time since I've graduated from high school, so much in that space has changed because of the internet. So in high school, I thought, I'll go work at a print magazine. That was sort of the idea, and then write fiction or what have you on the side. But, by the time I left college, that was really most of the jobs that were being offered were for digital publications.
And you came back to New York after New Haven, and did you got involved more in journalism? And
I went to work for a website called Serious Eats.
Yes.
Yeah, it does a lot of recipes. I did recipe development there. I did reviews. I did articles, interviews with chefs. I went to Columbia for the fiction program and left a little bit unsure about what I would do next. There's not, unless you're independently wealthy, there's not really an obvious next step to wanting to write your own book. How are you going to pay for your life? So I have always liked to cook and eat. And so I got a job at Serious Eats and then ended up doing that for a number of years. And even after I left Serious Eats, I continued to freelance in the food and travel space because who doesn't want to get paid to travel and eat? So that was really great. But I do, my first passion has always been literature. So eventually pivoted back.
Yes. I was curious with the Serious Eats, what kind of attracted you to that area? Was there any influences from history or family in the past?
My mom loves to cook. My mom's side of the family that came from Italy came here and became bakers, which I don't think I was even thinking about, but I became first the sweets editor at the website. It was divided at that time into, reviews, recipes, and sweets was its own vertical. So it was kind of funny given our family history that I ended up in charge of sweets. And yeah, I loved to bake, but I felt at the time like an exciting way to start to publish things as well. A website, things happen so much more quickly than a print magazine. So you are writing things at what becomes, kind of an astonishing rate. I think there was a inflection point when I was there where not just Serious Eats, but other publications realized that we were maybe putting out too much content. It felt that you had to just constantly be updating the website. And now I think as we've understood more how people read the internet and interact, you leave things up for longer. There's less of this crazy churn, although certainly it's for some publications there is. But it was also exciting too to just finally be getting my voice out there.
Mm-hmm. And did you have, I'm just kind of thinking with still related to that, did you have any favorite projects you worked on that you can think of with when you worked for Serious Eats?
I really enjoyed the recipe side. I still have recipes that I make. I still have people come and say, oh, I was searching for a lemon cake recipe and I started making it and then I realized it was yours. So that's also the funny thing about the internet is that for good or bad, that stuff stays around. But I had always liked cooking, and then this really pushed me to delve deeper into that and explore with new ingredients and new recipes, and it was really fun. I moved from New York to San Francisco during that time to be with my then boyfriend, now husband, and so we were living together, and I was just cooking things all the time, and he was my guinea pig, and it was fun.
Nice. And then you said you got interested more back into fiction, and that was something that you wanted to work on more separate from just food writing. And what kind of ideas were you thinking about when you were wanting to go back? Because you said fiction, but you have a new book coming out that's nonfiction. I was just curious.
I wasn't really sure what my own project would look like. My first concern when I switched back was how do I get deeper into the world of publishing, into the world of writers that I had sort of left behind for a while. So I went back to New York and I started working for a nonprofit literary magazine called Electric Literature, which is a fantastic website that publishes some of the best writers out there, especially in their literary magazine. And so I was really lucky to have that opportunity because they are really plugged in to the writing scene and they put out high quality writing and they're all passionate about it. So to be dropped back into that world of people who wanted writing to be their lives was a really important step, I think, because it can be daunting. It's so difficult to get a literary agent to publish, to make money. So that was a really good first step. And while I was there, I started to have ideas about what I might like to do. But I also became pregnant with my older son, and that's a whole new ballgame because then you have to balance, childcare and writing, and that eventually ended up leading to the book that I wrote, luckily, because it was a way of taking all of these ideas that I was having about motherhood and the experience of motherhood and merge it with this longstanding desire to write a book and do a deeper dive into a subject like that.
And so you have a forthcoming book coming out called The Book of Mothers, How Literature Can Help Us Reinvent Modern Motherhood. You mentioned a little bit about with your first son, but what was your initial response with how you linked the two ideas with motherhood and literature and the idea to write this book?
When I had my son, I tried to do what I normally do when I'm about to embark on a new experience, which is to read about it. Even if I'm traveling somewhere, I like to go to the library and get all of the books about Rome and read about it before I get there. So when I got pregnant, I thought, I should read about motherhood. And I also started to think, well, what books have I read that have given me an idea of what motherhood would be like? And I drew a blank, really, which is not to say that I haven't read a number of books with mothers in them, because obviously it's hard to find a book without a mother. It's such a common character. But I didn't feel as though I had read something that gave me any expectations that were fitting what I started to feel, whether in pregnancy or then having a newborn. There were some things that had been written more recently that, I found more helpful, but overall it was kind of odd. It was the first time where I really felt like I didn't have a book to turn to. And, growing up, you can turn to a book like, what is my first love going to be like? And you open The Great Gatsby and you're reading the backstory of Daisy and Gatsby and the excitement that he feels. And there are these books that capture a lot of our lives. And I just felt like modern motherhood wasn't represented in that way. So that really started me thinking about why that might be, and more specifically, the distance between the fact that there are mothers in books and maybe I'm not seeing or talking about these mothers in a way that is reflective of my actual experience or the experiences of other, women that I see around me.
Mm-hmm. And when did you start the process of writing the book?
I didn't start until after I had my second child, another boy. He was born, and I was actually on maternity leave when my now agent reached out to me based on some writing she had seen of mine on electric literature. And she said, this is me, and do you have an idea for a book? And I was in that very sleep-deprived phase, but I saw the opportunity for what it was, and so wrote back and said, well, I do have, some thoughts. And it was extremely lucky that I got connected to the agent that I did, because she is amazing. She's smart, she's supportive, and she really helped me shape the book proposal, which is honestly half the battle to getting something published. It's really a unique skill that she had to, translate my book idea into something that was sellable and interesting, and she helped refine it. And so that was incredibly helpful. And then we went out to publishers, and I lucked out and got connected to my editor, who is also so smart and totally on board with what I saw for the book. And so then I started writing in 2021. The actual book.
And in terms of raising your two children, are there any specific things within that process that have inspired anything with the creation of the book? Not that you can pick out any specific chapters or anything, but just overall with moving forward with the book. I know you've touched on it some.
Yeah, absolutely. The book, when we were chatting before, I mentioned how difficult it was to choose which mothers to include in the book. And ultimately, it was a balance between wanting a certain representation of the timeline. I try and cover what we would sort of consider the creation of modern motherhood. So stretching back, the earliest book is Pride and Prejudice. So I wanted to sort of cover the timeline in a even way, and also choose books that were popular enough to have really influenced the way that we talk about motherhood. So there are books that I love that deal with motherhood, but, maybe they weren't well known enough to really have moved the needle in the way I kind of wanted to talk about. But then there's obviously a subjective piece that was what's my angle into all of these books, and it was always something personal. So the book blends research with some personal anecdotes to help ground it, and I hope make it more sympathetic to other women who can say, oh yeah, that's what I'm going through.
Mm-hmm. And you've included numerous literary classics and mother figures in your book. Is there one particular mother that you've gravitated towards? I don't know if I want to say a favorite of yours, but something that really stands out to you in one of your chapters.
They were all incredibly interesting. One that I have been thinking about a lot since writing it is Emma Bovary. In part, it was an interesting one because I had read Emma Bovary before, but in French, not understanding probably half of it. And so when I went back to it, I picked up Lydia Davis's translation, which is wonderful, and was really blown away by how differently I felt about the book than a lot of critics do, or the way that it's often taught in schools. So Emma Bovary is the story of a provincial girl who marries a boring doctor who she's not in love with, and has a set of scandalous affairs, and then kills herself. And what's often forgotten about Emma Bovary is that she doesn't kill herself because she gets exposed as an adulteress. She kills herself because she's been called up on her shopping debts. She is a woman who's addicted to shopping. And the time that Flaubert was writing was a real sea change in terms of how we acted as consumers. Suddenly you had the Industrial Revolution putting out all sorts of objects that were previously reserved for the rich. So the bourgeoisie class was growing, and they were self-identifying by buying things that marked them as who they wanted to be. You could buy a certain tea set that was fashionable. You could buy clothes that indicated that you were part of a certain class. It was suddenly very common that you were using these objects to say something about yourself. And that's what Emma's trying to do. She's trying to elevate herself and create this life that she sees for herself by buying all of these goods from this very sinister local merchant who brings things over and, you know, convinces her just to, you know, oh, just try it on. And she's trying to fill this hole in her life because she's in a very unhappy marriage and she doesn't have anything to do with her days. And it felt really familiar because she's being told by others that this is a way that you can kind of express yourself. And then she comes up short. And in the age of social media, it just feels very familiar, you know, especially with Instagram, which I'm on way too much. There's a lot of blending between this line of, okay, what are we being sold and what are just, you know, people's real lives, and people are using these photos and what they're wearing and what they own in order to sort of express who they are. And with motherhood, it's incredibly powerful. You know, you see moms, they've got a certain type of, you know, baby hat, or they have certain types of natural this, you know, certain types of cups. I mean, there's so many things you can buy your baby, so it's really like never ending, you know. Mm-hmm. and it all sort of is supposed to speak, you know, the companies would have you believe that it really speaks to who you are as a mother, you know, and how well you're mothering. Do you have these things? So, but what you start to realize as you accumulate all of this stuff is that it doesn't have anything to do with how you mother, you know, really. And that is something that exists between you and your child, and comes out in obviously all the more kind of subtle ways. So, but there's this pressure, and I certainly, you know, feel it as a mom. And here's Emma Bovary dealing with the same thing like so long ago. And so a lot of the takes on her has been that, oh, she's superficial. She's just, you know, vapid. She just wants to spend her husband's money. But what Flaubert really understood was that for women in particular, there's a pressure to conflate your identity with the home. You know, you're in charge of the home, so you shop for it. So what you buy is an expression of yourself. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to do that to a certain extent. It's nice to decorate your house. I enjoy it. But does it become a way to limit women? You're taking up time and mental space and money that might be used for other things. And you're just indicating that these are the ways that you should think about yourself and who you are. And so I found that to all ring true, especially, I've always shopped, but having kids just blew me away with how much there was to buy and how many decisions to be made and what did it say about me. It wasn't just buying the right teething toy, it was which one and,
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, linking the Emma Bovary and the social media of today. And with some of the authors that you've picked, like with Flaubert, for even a male at that time to kind of write it in a way that's, I mean, it's obviously going to be more from that time period, but if you can kind of grasp some of the understanding and how he might be trying to portray women and maybe make people understand what they might have been going through at that time. There were a lot of male writers at that time writing about women, but that was one that kind of really you felt was unique in that way.
Flaubert definitely is unique. He had a lot of sympathy for his character. He famously said, I am Emma, Emma c'est moi. And it stems, I think, from a skepticism over this consumer culture that he saw building around him that he didn't really approve of. He has some great quotes about, boredom and how it eats away at your entrails. And what he meant was this boredom that you have in a modern society where you're not engaging in genuine tasks and connections. You're using shopping or what have you to kind of superficially paper over these holes. Then he was trying to find more meaning. And I think it's interesting when people do criticize Emma Bovary because the author had a lot of sympathy. I think that's different, for example, than maybe to go back to Gatsby. Fitzgerald, I think, had a more complicated relationship with Daisy Buchanan. And when we look at that book, we might want to think more about the fact that it's a man writing and the preconceived notions he might be bringing to that character. Whereas Flaubert, I think, was absolutely on Emma's side.
Mm-hmm. And just in general, with motherhood, what do you see the future of motherhood, and do you see it changing and becoming more multi-layered and not viewed in just a narrow lens?
I think we're already on a great path, especially when women are talking to or writing for each other. I think there's an openness and a candor that's incredibly important. What I found interesting in writing this book was this question of, so what do we do with older texts? Do we have to get rid of them because they no longer represent the kind of motherhood that we want for ourselves? And I personally think that while there are some texts that are sort of irredeemably hurtful or harmful, in general, you're always learning something from how things were. And even if it's to say, this is how things were and it was so bad, it's important to engage with that. And I think a lot of books go beyond that, and actually they're not necessarily negative, and they can spark an interesting conversation, but it's that we're not treating them in that way. The way that we teach motherhood in schools, for example, or I experienced in school, was much more flat. So you have a character like Mrs. Ramsay from To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and she's based off of Woolf's own mother, Julia Stevens, who was traditional. She voted against women's suffrage, which did not please Virginia. But she wrote this book as an exploration of who is this woman and is there anything redeeming about her, and also what forces around her maybe led her to be the way that she is. And that mindset is one that I think we should apply to all these books. What was at work, not just the author who was writing it, were they sympathetic or not? What were the expectations for mothers at the time? How have they changed? And can we talk about this in a way that's more layered, more nuanced, instead of, oh, she was a good mom, she was a bad mom? Because you get that a lot, mm-hmm. which I don't find to be particularly helpful.
No, and I think looking at some of the like you said, some of those books and how we might deal with them, and sometimes looking at it, you have to kind of not just look at it through the current lens of today and figure out what was going on at that time and how things were changing and what can you take from it and understand from that. But with the book, what do you kind of hope readers will take from your book?
I hope that I hope certainly that mothers feel seen, that their interests and their problems are getting discussed in a way that feels, interesting and realistic to them. I'm someone who, I love to read pieces on my own experience. I just think it helps me understand it and feel less alone. And I think that pointing out that there are these great works of literature that actually can speak to them is a very comforting is maybe not the right word, but I think, I find literature comforting. I think it's nice to think that these books are speaking to me. So making sure that mothers feel like they haven't been cut out of literature, that it's there for them and that it's able to provide a nuanced way of talking about their experience. I also, and this is a big ask, I would hope that people who aren't mothers read the book. And I'm very, very sympathetic to the fact that before you have children, you don't necessarily find children interesting, because that's how I felt. I always wanted to have children, liked children, but I didn't feel compelled to read about the experience about motherhood in particular either. And that, I think, is a huge problem in terms of how do we create a nuanced conversation about motherhood? Well, you have to invite everyone in and you have to get everyone talking about it. It can't just be a conversation that exists within the community of mothers. It can't be this siloed experience. And it's also shocking when you think that everyone has a mom, whether you like her or not. It's a very common relationship. So I would hope that as a society, we're moving to a place where everyone finds those characters as interesting as, as men, because male characters have historically represented the universal experience, and we're moving beyond that. But I find motherhood to be especially sticky in that regard. We've started to see lots of books with different protagonists from different ages and races and genders, but something about a character being a mother, it's like, oh, that's a story for mothers, for women, and that feels frustrating. So I'm hoping that we're going to be moving beyond that.
Mm-hmm. And now that you'll have this book being released, do you have any other future ideas or books in mind that you might be working on?
I am working on some fiction writing that I've put on the back burner for a while, so trying to make some space for that. Although having written this book just spurred lots of other ideas about especially women writers that I would love to do a deeper dive into. So maybe one day that'll be the next project.
And separate from the book, I wanted to ask, because you had mentioned the story with Gardner's Island, but while living in New York City, had you visited the North Fork at all, even as a child?
So I didn't visit as a child. I did come in my 20s, and then during COVID, we found a rental in Orient and moved out here, and we're just blown away. I mean, it's so beautiful. It's so special. The access to nature is really important for us now that we have 2 little kids. I love birds. I want to get more into birding. I've taken some bird watching classes, but I'm still very much a novice, so I'm hoping to improve that. So we rented a couple places in Orient, and then we're lucky we had no intention to build a house, but COVID real estate situation was very difficult. Everyone wanted to buy a house, so there was really nothing that we found. And then kind of lucked into this land. Anyway, we built a house, which has been we've been living in it for about 6 months, and it's just, it's fantastic being out here, seeing the change of the season into spring. It just reminds you, I love it off season, so to speak, here too. And the winter has its own austere beauty, but the arrival of the ospreys and all the, seeing people going fishing, and we just got the boys' little fishing rods, and so it's exciting. Orient's really special because it feels like the end of the land. I really have always been drawn to those places. Growing up, we went to, and we still go to, Wellfleet and Cape Cod, which is also, out there, water on both sides. I love the sense of being suspended in the ocean. And part of why I was drawn to it was that it reminds me so much of Wellfleet, which I love so much. And it was interesting to find out, historically, even the connections between New England and Orient and the North Fork were so strong, and you can see the same cedar shake houses, and the feel is very similar. The oyster industry. So I love all of that about it. And yeah, just mostly the sense of you're driving around and you can always feel the water. I think that's really special. I think it imparts a very unique quality to the light and to the air. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And no, I think that's wonderful. And I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today and telling your story. And definitely go check out the book of Mothers, How Literature Can Help Us Reinvent Modern Motherhood will be coming out very soon. And welcome to the North Fork.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 50 with Carrie Mullins. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.